Hey everyone, Mrs. Van Gundy here. So here we are doing our first screencast. We are going to be discussing, this is topic 2.6, adaptations. This is the real bread and butter of our world. So that's a rock pocket mouse, that's a picture of. So we know that organisms adapt, okay? So we know this because of your freshman year of biology and some of your middle school years as well. Now let's just think about our biomes. When you guys did biome speed dating, you listed certain adaptations that plants and animals that existed in those biomes had. And the reason that they have these adaptations, or the reason that they show these traits or demonstrate these traits, is because they give them some sort of advantage in the ecosystem or environment that they live in their habitats, in their niche. The picture here is the picture of Darwin's finches, so the infamous finches that Peter and Mary Grant studied on the Galapagos Islands, and they named them Darwin's finches. And the reason that they're so integral is because if you look at all of these different finches, you can see the differences, the sometimes minute little differences in their beak shape. And so much of that has to do with what they're eating, okay? And this is pretty pivotal. So those that have certain beak shapes are going to be preying or eating cacti more often, and those that have smaller beaks or beaks that are attuned to the seeds that they're eating are going to be able to obviously get more resources and therefore reproduce. So those traits will be passed on to future generations. Now remember, adaptations and evolution does not happen in one generation. It doesn't happen in 10 generations. It happens over many, many, many generations. That's why we study it in Drosophila, because they have many generations in a really short amount of time. So it's easy to see the passing on of these traits. So here is just a little depiction of natural selection. So the theory that was proposed by Darwin says that evolution is basically descent with modification. The idea that species change over time, they're going to give rise to new species eventually, but they will all share a common ancestor. Because resources are limited in nature and there's competition, there are going to be those that garner more resources, therefore produce more offspring, and pass those traits onto future generations. It causes populations to become adapted over time and to become increasingly well suited to their environments. So this is where we get what's happening with the environment, like what characteristics and traits is the environment showing, and then the species that live in that environment will be adapted to garner resources from that environment. So again, natural selection depends on the environment, and it requires existing heritable variation in a group. And this is where I talk about the differences in alleles and why it's so important to have a big gene pool of alleles to choose from, because they may not be deleterious, they may not be advantageous, but if the environment ever changes, perhaps then they will be deleterious or advantageous. But you have to have variety in order to have something to choose from. Otherwise, it's boring. Just like with us, I mean, look at all the variation that sits in front of us, right? We are all extremely different in some way. This is because we have a large variation of alleles. This goes for showing with all species, right? So organisms of the same species are never exactly the same, which is great. You want to have lots of variation within a species, because then that gives more traits to choose from. Oops. All right, so the variation between different members of the same species, either physical or behavioral, will allow some members to be better fitted to survive their environments. If that environment changes due to natural or anthropological causes, I was going to say anthropogenic, different traits may cause members of the species to be better fitted for the environment. An example of this is the standard example of the peppered moth. So here we're going to watch the evolution of the peppered moth.
The peppered moth is a species of moth found in England. There are two variations of color in the species. Some moths are white with dark speckles, and some moths are dark with light speckles. The peppered moths live in environments with light-colored trees, like birch trees. Which moth do you think has an advantage in this environment? Can you find the moths? There's one more, do you see it? The light-colored moths had an advantage for survival. Their color helped them to blend into their environment and hide from hungry predators like birds. The dark-colored trait was a disadvantage. Moths with this trait were more easily spotted by predators and had a lower chance of survival. Since the light-colored trait had an advantage for survival, it was more commonly seen in the population. This was due to natural selection. Individuals who are best suited for an environment survive longer, reproduce more times, and pass on their genes. Natural selection over many generations can cause noticeable evolutionary changes in a species, and the peppered moth is the perfect example. In the 1800s, the Industrial Revolution took place. Manual labor was taken over by machinery. Factories began to produce goods. These factories were powered by coal. The burning of coal released a lot of pollution. Dark clouds of soot and ash lingered in the air and even settled on the trees. Over time, the once light-colored trees were covered in a layer of dark soot. Which color variation had the advantage after industrialization changed the environment? The dark-colored moths now had the advantage. They were able to blend well into the soiled trees, while the light-colored variation stood out. Light-colored moths were more easily spotted by predators and had a lower chance of survival. They reproduced less often, and the frequency of this trait decreased over time. The dark-colored moths increased in frequency after many successful generations of survival and reproduction. But this story has one more plot twist. It didn't take long for people to realize that air pollution was a major problem. Laws were put into place and factories began to reduce their emissions. The skies were once again clear, and the trees as well returned to their natural light color. As a result, over time, the dark moths decreased in frequency, and the light moths became the more common variation once again. This is evolution by natural selection.
Okay, so you can see how the environment led to different varieties of the same species to have an advantage. That's a classic example of evolution. So let's talk about some myths of evolution, because I'm sure you've heard of those that are non-believers in evolution for whatever reason. First one is, oh, it's just a theory, right? If you've been in the sciences for any amount of time, you've always heard, oh, it's just a theory. However, in science, scientific theory has a much different meaning than theory in the regular world. So in order to become a scientific theory, it has to be tested rigorously, and it has to be able to be reproducible, and it has to have many experiments that follow it and support it in order to become a scientific theory. And evolution is a scientific theory, and everything that's tested, for the most part, supports the theory of evolution. Another one is that humans are no longer evolving. Individual organisms, we are just like any other organism. So if every other organism is subject to evolution, we are too. Individual organisms can evolve in a single lifespan. Right? This is not true. Evolution isn't science since it can't be observed or tested. And humans and monkeys can't have a common ancestor because they are still monkeys. Let's watch. Yep, so if somebody tells you that you evolved from monkeys, you just tell them, that's so wrong. I came from a bacterial cell. Duh. All right, here are some other myths that go along with evolution. Fitness means strongest, fastest, or biggest, not in the terms that we're speaking of. Fitness is the best fit for the environment. In order to measure fitness, you measure ability to acquire resources, because the ability to acquire resources goes right along in lines with how many kids you have. So not necessarily on the human level, but for most other species. So the acquisition of resources would be a fit mate, and therefore you're going to have high fecundity, which means you're going to be able to produce a lot of progeny. So that progeny is going to have your traits, and over many generations, you're going to have a population of that progeny with those traits, which equals adaptations, aka evolution, through natural selection. So another one is organisms develop new traits in order to help them in the environment. So this is like saying the giraffes grew long necks because they wanted to reach the higher leaves. They willed it upon themselves, when in fact, the most favorable traits will allow organisms to live and reproduce. So it was the giraffes, or the descendants, the early descendants or ancestors of giraffes that were able to reach the higher leaves, get more resources, produce more progeny, and over time, that longer neck became an evolutionary trait that's witnessed in the populations that we see now. Another one is that evolution is a constant progression towards some perfect ideal, right? So like it's just going to stop. But that's just it, is evolution has no end goal. It's just going to keep going and going and going as long as environmental conditions change, and we know that they are constantly changing. Therefore, evolution is constantly occurring. All right, so here is Mr. Darwin himself. So what we're talking about here is ERT dash 2.H-2. So these are all like goals that you should be able to discuss in your AP environmental science exam. These are for Unit 2. So this one is environmental changes, either sudden or gradual, may threaten a species' survival, requiring individuals to alter behaviors more or perish. And Darwin here says, it is not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent that survives. It is the one that is most adaptable to change. So those that have the most variation, that puts them in an advantage in whatever environment they're in. So that being said, species will change as conditions change, because so much of this is ruled by the environment that they find themselves in. One way that speciation events can occur is through geographic isolation. So here's a nice little depiction of one population of snails having obviously variation within their alleles, even though they're not exhibited through their genotype. They're not genotypically exhibited. They are exhibited through their genotype, but not through their phenotype, because they all look phenotypically identical, even though there is variation amongst the alleles, which is genotypic. All right, so let's say that separation of continents, so remember Pangea, they get split up, right? So half of the snails are over here, half of the snails are over here. They've got different environments that they're in now. They're no longer able to breed with each other across these groups, so they are going to develop traits that are unique to their population. And over time, that will lead to speciation, which means that they are no longer going to be able to produce fertile offspring with members of their old population, who are now a new species themselves. So the two groups are now in their own unique ecosystems. They're going to each experience unique pressures. They're going to adapt to their environment over time and can eventually become very different from each other. So different, in fact, that they can no longer mate with each other to produce viable offspring. That's speciation. Earthquakes. Earthquakes can put a divide between different sets of a population, causing speciation events, because you've isolated populations. Volcanoes, they can do the same thing. They can destroy habitat, cause extinction. Lava is obviously extremely hot. It's going to destroy everything in its path. And this is a picture of Mount St. Helens. This is in 1980 when it exploded, and now, well, close to now, in 2016. Species can recover after large natural disturbances. But those species that do recover and come back may not be genetically identical to the species that were there before, because it's going to represent different advantages in the allele variation that are in the environment now. Okay, so they may be completely different species than what was present in 1980. Asteroids. So you've all heard of the dinosaurs, right? And the mass extinction event with dinosaurs due to possible meteor or asteroid impact. So this can cause widespread extinction, and it can also cause climate change. So organisms must either adapt to the change or the species die. Now remember, adaptation is not a willful thing. So those that have the mutation within their genome, or even if it's represented with their phenotype, will be the ones that will then be able to acquire more resources, produce more offspring, and over time, so all happens over generations and generations and generations, a new population with those traits exists. It's not just one individual. All right, climate change is another natural disturbance that can lead to speciation events. So we've gone through cyclical ice ages and warming periods. Problem with what's going on right now is it's all stimulated, most of it by man, by anthropogenic influences. So that's caused it to escalate much quicker than it would naturally from what we know of record, and the record goes back over 10,000 years. So ice ages and warming periods can cause species to migrate if they can. Not all species are physiologically inclined to just understand to migrate. They don't think like we do. So not all of them are going to just be like, hey, it's getting colder, I guess I'll move further north. They don't have logical thought like us. So it all depends on if it's a physiological mechanism that they have. So if they're unable to move, the organisms of that species best able to adapt will live and procure resources and pass those abilities on to their offspring. If not, it's likely that the species will die off. So let's talk about some different adaptations that organisms possess. So we've got things called structural adaptations, and these are adaptations to actual body structures. So they're going to allow animals to more proficiently procure food, to defend themselves. So if you can defend yourself better, you're going to survive longer. You're going to be able to mate with more people, well, not people, sorry, more individuals, and produce more offspring, right? So therefore, fit. Okay. Structural adaptations can include such things like body color, because that gives you ability to camouflage or hide yourself in your environment. Body covering, so how much fat you have on your body, or how lean you are, how muscular you are. You know, like antelope are extremely fast due to their structure. I mean, just purely by structure, they are like so lean, they are all muscle. Beak type, again, for procuring resources, and claw type for being able not only to defend yourself, but also to get food, especially if you're a raptor, that's to get prey. Plants also have adaptations. Plants are amazingly adaptive. This is my bread and butter, because I used to study adaptations in plants. I used to study drought resistance in pine trees. I know it sounds thrilling. You can come to my office hours and we can talk about it forever, because I'm sure you're so excited. Some adaptations, structural adaptations in plants, help them to live and reproduce. So things like whether or not they're poisonous, right, to certain organisms, or if they're very bitter. So like the Western yew is a plant, if you bite into it, the tannins in the bark, it's super bitter, so you would spit it out right away, and that helps the plant to survive because no one wants to bite it, no one wants to eat it, therefore they're going to let it live. Some have thick leaves or spines, which makes them not only unpleasant to eat, but it also helps them to conserve water. That's why many of our desert plants are prickly and they're kind of ouch, right? So because of their metabolic sequences that they go through is quite different, and it's all for water preservation. And that's all been developed through adaptations. So what I used to study were pinyon pine trees, and I used to study them in the Mogollon Rim of Arizona, which is this big drop off. So it goes from like 6,000 feet to 3,000 feet in a matter of, as far as width is concerned, in a matter of like just a couple hundred feet. So it's just this really big cliff that runs all along the middle of Arizona. And anyway, in this zone in between, on the top, we had 2 needles per fascicle. Down in the bottom, as you get closer to like Phoenix, it gets warmer, like Payson area, there was only 1 needle per fascicle. So I studied the hybrid zone, right? So like on some plants, they had 2 needles per fascicle and 1 needle. So there was a drought resistant gene in there, and we were studying what was the gene, trying to isolate it, and then how did it, like what environmental conditions turned it on for certain plants. But these are all adaptations to actual structures, to the phenotype, that have allowed for them to have an advantage. Then we have behavioral or physiological adaptations. So these are adaptations that help the organism meet their needs for food, water, shelter, and protection. These are what we would consider learned behaviors, but they're not learned in the other organisms. They're in their genotype, but it's like mannerisms and traits that they exhibit in order to, better survive. So if you take a look, here is a dog and he's got a possum. What possums do when they're really freaked out is they play dead, right? But they don't think about it. They're like, oh my God, this dog's gonna get me, I'm just gonna lay dead. Nope, they're just like, I'm in danger, this is what I do, because that's just what's bred into them, okay? Over here, sunflowers, this is heliotropism. And what they do is when the sun, rises in the east, the heads of the sunflowers will it's slow. It's not like a really fast. They don't just like whip their heads around. They'll face the sun, and then as the sun moves, so will the heads of the sunflowers. So you can see they're all facing one way. Well, as the sun moves, all of those heads of the flowers will track the sun throughout the day. Pretty fascinating. Migration, that's another physiological thing. They don't think about it, but they just know to do it. Okay, the owls that live near me, they're going to migrate soon. But I haven't talked to them to ask like when it's happening, if they've packed their bags up, because it's in response to environmental stressors or factors, right? They're not like planning their trip. So let's talk about some owl adaptations. Here's a list. So totally silent flight from fringed flight feathers that muffle the sound of air passing through their feathers. They have large eyes set forward on their heads for great depth perception for hunting. Their necks have a large turning radius for following prey as they move. Their sharp talons are great for grabbing prey on the fly. So I want you, when you come to class, I want you to figure out, are these behavioral or are they structural? Go through each one, behavioral or structural. What would be a behavioral adaptation that an owl would have? So I just mentioned one earlier too. How about adaptations for the cold? Okay, polar bears are always like they're like our little climate change mascot, like the sad little mascot. An example here is the snowshoe hare. Long ears with dark tips, large dark eyes. They've got long whiskers. In winter, they are all white except for the tips of their ears. They've got a short tail, large, hairy back feet for traveling on top of deep snow. When it's not wintertime, they are not white. They're like a grayish color. Do you think that that's an adaptation? Do you think they think about changing their coat? It's getting warm out. I'm going to put my different colored coat on. All right, so polar bear adaptations. Most bears eat some plant matter. But where polar bears live, they have adapted to a completely carnivorous lifestyle. They do not forage on berries or any sorts of plants like Kodiak bear or grizzly bear do. They've got a muscle hump over their shoulders for catching large prey. You know how they reach in those holes and like grab their prey. They've got to have pretty strong lats for that. White fur helps them hide in plain sight. They have large furry feet for walking on ice and snow. So again, these are all structural adaptations, okay? All right, so that ends our first screencast on adaptations. I hope it was okay. If there are any questions, comments, or concerns, let me know. Come to class with your responses to structural or behavioral, and we will discuss when I see you in class, and we'll do some cool things with adaptations. All right, peace.